group, they were all madly taking notes. What this gentleman was saying to them was truth. They didn't even have the resources to engage the arguments that that professor was making to determine whether it was true or not. At Westminster Academy and at most classical Christian schools, we begin formal rhetoric in 7th and 8th grade. Then we begin formal logic in 7th and 8th grade, excuse me. Then we begin formal rhetoric in 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. Let me tell you what that looks like. In 10th grade, our sophomores must memorize a 15 to 20-minute speech. It must be well-reasoned. It must be persuasive. It must be winsome. It must be done with integrity. At the end of that speech, those students have to defend that orally in front of their peers, faculty, visitors, parents. So at the end of this speech, you'll have these people raise their hand and say, I don't think your argument was valid. Can you explain? I don't think you used this point. Why wouldn't you have used that point? And it goes on and on. Friends, there's not a student that will graduate from Westminster Academy that can't give a 15 to 20-minute fully memorized, well-reasoned speech. 2 weeks ago, I took one of our juniors to California. The reason we went there is that this school was beginning their upper school. And they had a number of families that were kind of on the edge of, gee, I don't know whether we want to hang around while you figure out the upper school. So we took our junior there in a sense to illustrate the end product of a classical Christian education. This young man stood up, gave a 20-minute speech, and I tell you no lie, it was probably one of the finest speeches, and I get emotional about this, that I've ever seen. And this is an 11th grader. At the end of this speech, 350 parents started to applaud. And friends, it was not gracious applause. It was not polite applause. It was vigorous applause. And they applauded, and they applauded, and they applauded. And the young man sat down, and I started to walk up on stage, and they were still applauding. And I turned to him, and I said, you're going to have to stand back up and acknowledge this. He stood back up, gave a brief acknowledgement, and he sat back down. And guess what? They continued to applaud. Probably for another 2 minutes. And the overwhelming sense I had was that they were acknowledging the quality of his presentation. But beyond that, you know what I thought I saw and I heard as some parents wiped tears out of their eyes? Is our kids are capable of doing that. But the problem is the educational system that you're part of today, what we expect from even our seniors basically is pitiful. Friends, there was a time 150 years ago when students went to the university at age 15 knowing calculus, Latin, and Greek. They didn't get stupider. There's a method of education that I think we are rediscovering that understands that a 3-year-old loves to learn and he is far better at reasoning than we give him credit for. What we're trying to do in classical education is at the very least get out of the way of that, because you know what? Some schools get in the way of it. By 2nd grade, they've overwhelmed them with handouts. We have parents coming to our school saying that the reason we're here is that our children have been told they cannot ask questions. We have had parents that have brought children to our school that have said, we have our children back again. And that is because we love questions. It's grist for the mill. We take what they do naturally and they do well, and we take that and we use that. We use that how? Back to what Pastor Stacy said. Folks, they need to know how to reason. Quickly, let me talk to you about this Christian component of the school. We believe God created the universe. And again, Jay referred to this. What does that mean? That means that there's not one subject that cannot reflect something about the very nature and character of God. What we've done in our education system, and even in some respects in Christian education, is the kids all go to their normal subjects and then they have a Bible class and they don't mix. And what we're saying is we are capturing once again the idea that no, everything can reflect God's character. And what are examples of that? Let me talk to you briefly about literature. Do you know that all literature has similar themes? There was good and evil came. And then we needed a hero, and the hero shows up and he saves us just in time and we live happily ever after. Well, we know these themes, but there's something that goes beyond that. And that is, you know what? They move our hearts, don't they? We cheer, we weep, we get angry. Well, do you know why that is? And this is what we tell our students. It's because it's their story. There was good, evil came. They needed a hero and he came and he redeemed them. And you will live happily ever after. So whether it's secular literature or whether it's Christian literature, The same themes and stories are being told, but now literature explodes, doesn't it? It's not just a book. It's not just a story. It's part of our story. And as they read these stories, they can see something about the great story, his story. And so when we talk about his story, folks, we're talking about history. There was a beginning and there is an end. And every single one of those students have been brought into his story, history, at a particular time, at a particular place, for a particular purpose. Let me give you another example of how subjects can lead us to the God we serve. When we talk about music in classical Christian education, we talk about proportion and ratio and math and physics. Well, why do we do it that way? Well, when I play a major chord, it sounds good. Do you know why? Because its proportion's the same. It's thirds. When I play a minor chord, it sounds a little bit off. It's 2/3 and a 1/4. And people who work with music know that at the end of a piece, you always want to resolve to a major chord. It's the big sigh at the end. It feels done. So why is this important? It's important because when you walk outside and you see the tree has proportion and ratio. When you cut the nautilus shell in half, the nautilus shell has proportion and ratio. We teach our kindergartners that the body has proportion and ratio. The head is in thirds, the body's in thirds, the arms in thirds. Folks, God is a God of proportion and ratio. Beauty is not relative. When you're asking kids, why is that painting beautiful? They need to be able to defend why it's beautiful. Not just, I like it. When they say music is good, and you ask them, why is that good? And they say, I like it. You go, no. You tell me why it's good. Why? Because there are standards of beauty, and they're God's standards. But I come from a generation that can't defend it. And so my kid runs circles around me, and it drives me nuts. So let me bring these two together, and I'll close with this. We're trying to teach kids how to reason well and how to ask good questions. Let me say the following carefully. There's some churches and some schools, and underline some, and parents, where we say to students, here's the issue. When you get out in the world, this is the issue you're going to face. Well, we're going to equip you by having you memorize this answer. So you get this issue, this is how you'll defend it with this memorized answer. Well, the problem with that, folks, is there are far too many issues. You can't memorize all the answers. And when you get into college and you try and regurgitate a memorized answer because of others' ability to reason, in essence, you just get creamed, you get laid out. You're not able to ask them questions which expose what's true and what's not, right? And so what we're attempting to do, and what we aspire to do in classical Christian education, is equip a generation that is able to engage culture at a level where they can reason with them and defend their faith, expose the fallacies in the arguments of others, and even for themselves, as they're faced with new issues, ask questions, and through asking questions get to a point where they themselves see, here's the truth, here's the untruth, now I have to make a decision, rather than somebody else convincing them it's true. And finally, in a classical education, we're bringing your children underneath the greatest thinkers of all time, the Augustines, the Plato, the Aristotle, on and on and on. And why is that? It's because these gentlemen and women dealt with the greatest ideas of Western civilization. What were they? What is beauty? What is virtue? What is true? Right? So these educators are bringing your children underneath these folks who argued and reasoned about what are these things. Well, now when your children go out into the world, rather than the world changing them, they can change the world because they have been schooled in the ability to engage culture in a purposeful, meaningful, effective, well-reasoned way. And because it's a Christian environment, folks, we know too of a mighty God who works miracles and who ultimately is about hearts. And one of the things we have to be careful of is producing students who can out-reason people but aren't engaging them with integrity and humility to win their hearts. And it's a high calling to be involved in a classical Christian education. And folks, you have a great opportunity here in Noonan to be involved in what I believe to be one of the finest. Thank you.